It is 1500 hours GMT, just 4 p.m. In Algeria. The breaking news here on Al Jazeera is from the man you've just been hearing there, the army chief in Algeria, who is calling for a vacancy of the presidency. Remember, President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, he wanted to run to a fifth term. We saw those weeks of protests in Algeria against his rule because of his physical state there. As you see, 82 years old, in a wheelchair. He had a stroke many years ago. And what is being called for by the head of the army is something called Article 102 of the Constitution, which says if the president is unable to exercise his tasks due to a serious or chronic disease, then he should be removed from power. And that is what has been called for by the head of the army. Quite a development there. And we're going to start by talking to Francis Rekeelless about this now, who is a former Financial Times North Africa correspondent. He's actually in Barcelona right now on Skype for us. And we thank you for your time, Francis. Your initial reaction to this, first of all, I mean, it is always crucial in these situations and these countries as to how the army will react. And now we see that.
Well, I think the army has reacted in a strictly constitutional way at last, which is the important thing. I have often pointed out that the Algerian army is often criticised, notably for its corruption. Whatever the corruption may be, certain officers at the top, the Algerian army is over 500,000 people, and many of its officers, most of it, are very professional people. Therefore, it has done its duty by Algeria. And I think that's all for the good, because the key point about what has happened in the last few weeks is that it has been peaceful. It's brought millions of people into the streets. There has not been the slightest incident. And I think this is an absolutely key element, particularly coming from an Arab country, that there should be peace and respect between the different parties in this very complex game.
What has to happen now, then? Because it's one thing for the head of the army to call for Article 102. How does that actually get invoked, and how could it play out? Well,
the actual mechanics of how it's going to work, I do not know. You have to remember that every Friday there have been massive demonstrations for the last month. But the question now is going to be the interim government of Algeria. How is Algeria going to be governed in the 6 months or more or less it needs to frame either a new constitution, changes to the constitution, and have an election, a presidential election, which is clean and transparent? That is the key problem that faces Algeria today.
And it's a real acceleration of the whole process, isn't it? Because while Abdelaziz Bouteflika said, yes, I won't run for that fifth term, he did lay out a very long period for there to be a new constitution and a change in power, basically to give himself the longest amount of time to get out safely.
Well, I wrote a few days ago in an article that the Algerian army, the way to manage the transition, if it can be managed, is that the army, the National Army of Algeria, has held the revolutionary and historical legitimacy of the country. Now, with these massive demonstrations in the streets of Algeria, the people have claimed their share of legitimacy. So the army is going to have to give to a certain extent. If it wants to give, it's the last time it can ask some people who were in the revolution, who are clean, who've held senior positions in Algeria before, like former President Yamin Zeroual, the former Prime Minister of the Great Reforms of 25 years ago, Mouloud Hamrouche, to, in a sense, with younger people and members of civil society, to manage a government or an administration of transition, whose key job will be to organize fair and free elections when they deem best.
Just looking at some pictures, Francis, on screen of some of the many protests, the weeks of protests that happen. This decision today, will this be enough for the people of Algeria, do you think? Because whilst they were initially pleased that Bouteflika wasn't going to run again, that turned to concern once again about how long it was going to take for him to leave and who would take his place.
Well, I think we are going through a very, the waters can be very treacherous. what I notice is that the chief of staff, who was speaking of a Syrian situation a few weeks ago, is now addressing his countrymen in measured and sober and constitutional terms, which is very important. The army newspaper El Jaish 10 days ago came out with an editorial where it said, we will never turn against the people of Algeria. So if the army keeps its head cool and whatever discussions go on inside the army, they find a common ground. And if there are no incidents in the streets, because remember, there have been attempts to provoke in the last 2 Fridays in Algiers. These attempts to provoke are natural in such a situation, but one can only hope they will not succeed. And then as long as people can dialogue, the main thing is that the Algerian people, be they the army high command, be they the bulk of officers, be they ordinary people, be they civil society, should learn to debate and to discuss without resort to violence. And then the exact way this transition is going to be constructed, well, I'm not a seer. I can't second guess the Algerian people.
Francis Rekeelless, I wonder if you'll just stay with us, if you don't mind, whilst we actually speak to some of our other correspondents and analysts, and we will come back to you shortly. If you are just joining us on Al Jazeera, 1500 hours GMT, and we are dealing with breaking news out of Algeria, where Article 102 is being spoken about, that is of the Constitution, the Army Chief of Staff saying it needs to be invoked to take the president out of power. Remember, President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, he bowed to the pressure of all these protesters, which we saw for so many weeks, and said he wouldn't run for that 5th term. And would instead look to some sort of transition, a long transition, a new constitution. Well, now the head of the army is stepping in and saying that, no, he is not fit to lead right now because of his health, 82 years old, ailing, in a wheelchair. He had a stroke in 2013. He says he needs to be removed now. I'm going to bring in Hashem Ahelbarra, our correspondent on the line. He's actually in Tunisia at the moment, but Hashem, I mean, you've reported on Algeria a lot for Al Jazeera. You were here in the studio that night when Abdelaziz Bouteflika announced he wouldn't run. What's your initial read on this?
Well, Kamal, this is a moment that many Algerians have been waiting for, which is basically the decision of the most powerful institution in Algeria, the army. And today, the army Chief Gaid Salah has officially pulled out support for President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, saying that the Article 102 of the Constitution should be triggered, which means that the President of the Parliament will take over, paving the way for a new era in Algeria. Today, after that announcement by the army chief, the era of Abdelaziz Bouteflika is over.
But then the question becomes about what happens in the interim, doesn't it? Because already there was concerns about some of his associates becoming involved in power in Algeria during the changeover. This, as I said to an earlier guest, accelerates that changeover.
I think what will happen next is going to be totally different from the roadmap that was proposed by President Abdelaziz Bouteflika a few weeks ago when he announced a new reshuffle of the government, called for a transition to democracy and a council to take over to tackle the most important aspects of a new republic to be put in place in Algeria. I think what will happen in the coming days is basically call for a national dialogue with all members of the opposition, the protesters, all components of the society will come together and decide how to move forward. It's going to be undoubtedly a delicate task for Algeria, definitely a delicate task, because this is going to be taking the nation into some sort of an uncharted territory. But I think for the thousands of Algerians who have been taken to the streets over the last few weeks, this could be the glimmer of hope we've been waiting for quite some time.
OK, thanks for now, Hashem. Come back to you later on. But as you have been talking about what would happen in the immediate future, let's look in a little more detail at this Article 102 of the Algerian Constitution. It means if the president is believed to be unable to perform his duties because of a lasting illness, then Algeria's Constitutional Council has to assess his condition. If it unanimously agrees the president cannot continue, it then informs Parliament. Parliament then has to vote. What do we need from that? 2/3 of Parliament to support the removal of the president before any action can be taken. The chairman of the upper house will then assume a caretaker role that lasts 45 days. If the president's illness lasts longer than that, then elections can be called. I'll bring in Ahelbarra now, who is a research fellow at the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences, on Skype from Algiers. We talk to Amel a lot about developments in Algeria as they happen. So what's your take on, as I've just explained there, Article 102? If it does go through to a parliamentary vote, do you think there is enough support for it, that 2/3 majority, to remove him?
Well, first we have to ask ourselves for who did it. And we can consider Gaid Salah as a defender of democracy or as the defender of the Iraq. So we should not understand this move as a way to answer the people's demands or the demands of the demonstrations that have been going on for more than a month in Algeria. You know, historically, the Algerian power and the Algerian military has always created crisis and institutional crisis to use it to stay in place and to present himself as the only actor able to solve the crisis. That's how we should understand today's scenario. The army and the secret services, who have had some disagreements with the Bouteflika clan, have always tried to find a way after and a way forward after the Bouteflika presidency. And that's what they are trying to do currently. But that won't solve the issue of how can the Algerian people have their demands answered about the regime, about their willingness to see the regime leave.
So you're saying not to view Ahmed Gaid Salah, the army chief, as some sort of bastion of democracy, and yet he says the people's demands are valid after all those weeks and months of protests. Isn't it important to consider which side of things the army chief does land on?
Well, actually, we have to be clear and very focused. What are the demands of the people? They are to conduct a transparent transition under the control of people who will have their trust and who will be freely elected. Not to have the army once again, like in 1991, taking control of the country and having the army controlling the political field. That's absolutely not what the Algerian wants, and that's a dangerous move actually, because will the army be okay to let demonstrations? Because I'm sure that we are going to have other demonstrations in Algeria asking for the total leave of the regime, Gaid Salah included. Are the army going to give some guarantee about the fact that it will not repress the demonstrations? I hope so.
Can you tell us what the strength of the protests have been like? Obviously, they were very strong leading up to Abdelaziz Bouteflika saying that he wouldn't stand for president. I'm wondering what it's been like leading up to this point now and how you think it might change tomorrow.
Well, the demands of the protest, as you say, for the past months and even before, nobody has called the army to take over the transition process. Nobody, really. Maybe some opposition parties did so because they were in hope to be included in this transition to come. And these opposition parties have no credibility among the Algerian people because they have been co-opted by the power and by Bouteflika himself before. So that's why they have no credit and no credibility. But there has been a move since 1 month and secret negotiations between these parties, the army and the secret services, in order to organize a kind of inclusive national conference, as you mentioned. But that will be once again under the control of the people who are making the regime what it is. And the army is one of the components of this collegial governance in regime governance in Algeria. So we have to be clear about the demands of the people. Now, there were one taboo since the protests have started, which was the role of the army. You know, the day before each demonstration in Algeria, there were rumors on social networks that the army was at the doors of Algiers, the capital of Algeria, and the army was ready to erect the state of emergency again. And people were very, very afraid of that, and very clear that this was not what they want. And again, I mean, what they wanted was from Gaid Salah and from the army, more above all than from Gaid Salah, a guarantee that they will be able to conduct a transparent transition.
Ahelbarra, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time today.